This is Democracy,
a podcast about the people of the United States.
A podcast about citizenship.
About engaging with politics and the world around you.
A podcast about educating yourself on today's important issues.
And how to have a voice in what happens next.
Welcome to our new episode of This is Democracy. Today we're going to talk about a country that always stands out in any historical examination of the Western world, such as there is a Western world, and examinations of European security. This is the country of Hungary, which historically has played an absolutely pivotal role in every era of modern development in Europe. And it's a country that always stands out because of its linguistic uniqueness, its historical uniqueness, and again, the role it plays often between large empires to its east and to its west. Today, Hungary is led by Viktor Orbán, an elected leader of Hungary who, in the eyes of many, particularly in Western Europe and the United States, is not a fully participating member of NATO and the EU. Yet, of course, Hungary is a full member of NATO and the EU. And in the context of the war in Ukraine, the role of Hungary is particularly important in thinking about future East-West relations and the development of the European Union and NATO responses to Russia. We're fortunate today to be joined by a colleague and friend who knows more about Hungary and the wider European landscape than almost anyone else I know. This is Lorinc Redei, who we've had on the podcast, I think, before. He is a professor of instruction at the LBJ School at the University of Texas at Austin. He also served as a press officer in the European Parliament, which is the directly elected legislature of the European Union. And in that role, he really gained a lot of insight, I think, as someone who managed relations for the press corps and for many different members of the European Parliament on its Foreign Affairs Committee. He's written quite a bit and done research on these experiences and on European politics, the European Union, and questions of democracy and security in Europe. So we're fortunate to have his European expertise and his Hungarian expertise. He is a native of Hungary, in fact. So Lorinc, thank you for joining us today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Before we turn to our discussion with Lorinc, we have, of course, Mr. Zachary Suri's poem. What's the title of your poem today, Zachary?
In between.
Let's hear it.
In between, we are in between. The lampposts in Budapest count 1, 2, 3 up the banks, and while the sun sets, you count the minutes until darkness. 3, 2, 1. They are laughing at us. The river is laughing at us. Indignantly, we strut along its sides, stare at each other from across the way, and, with cold feet, we wade into the river's depths to emerge redeemed or covered in its cold sludge. In between, counting 1, 2, 3 until it is all gone. In between, the days go by, 4, 5, 6, and still we are in between. They are laughing at us. From oceans away, they are laughing at us, because we couldn't even bear to see the street musician covered in his silver paint flinch or tip his hat or hold up the newspaper in the square and wave it at us as if it were supposed to mean something. In between, we are in between. The lampposts count up to 1,000,000 along the banks of the Danube while the sun sets, while the missiles can be heard falling some miles away. 1, 2, 3. You have forgotten who you are. Blink thrice. 1, 2, 3, and the lights will all flicker on one by one. Blink thrice. 1, 2, 3. And maybe you'll miss the end of the world.
Your poem, Zachary, it really feels to me like a late 19th century Budapest or city of one kind or another with the lampposts and the lights. Is that what you're going for here?
I guess so. I think my poem is really about Hungary, but also the place of where my ancestors came from, which is Hungary, but also other parts of Central and Eastern Europe, and how they are both in between East and West, but also between past and future. And I think some of the pathologies that seem to come out in the Orban regime are the pathologies of that kind of trauma, but also that sense of historical weight.
Yeah, that's actually a very interesting way of thinking about it. Lawrence, as we think about the war in Ukraine, is Zachary's theme accurate for understanding the Hungarian government's position as both a member of NATO and the EU, and also an ally of Russia? Does this help to inform our understanding?
Absolutely. I think even the last time that I was on this podcast, I was wondering how I was going to start, and then Zachary's poem gave us the perfect intro, and it's the same thing today. I mean, that's exactly what I was going to start with, is that the Hungarian Prime Minister, Viktor Orban, has been especially clever and astute in figuring out exactly that space of in-between that he can hold, both as a staunch ally of Putin, which he has been for years now, as well as sort of keeping a foot in the Western world and in these important international organizations, the EU and NATO, right? So Orban has not hidden from anybody, right, that he is an admirer of Vladimir Putin and a close ally of his. They share a lot of their worldview of this illiberal nationalism that they think is the only reasonable response to sort of globalized liberal encroachment. And at the same time, of course, Hungary has remained a member of the European Union and of NATO, and has not even really flirted with the idea of leaving either of these organizations. And I think Orban has been able to get away with this kind of in two ways, right? He has gotten away with it domestically because he controls the media landscape in Hungary. He can use TV, radio, newspapers. All of these are in the hands of his allies to push whatever message he wants to the population. So this kind of in-betweenness is justified on a daily basis in the press, wherever you look. And the only independent press really that's left in Hungary is online, which, except for basically in Budapest, doesn't reach the vast majority of the population. And then the second question is, and this is, I think, the tougher one to explain, which is how Orban has gotten away with this internationally, right? Why the EU and NATO haven't responded, and why he hasn't been punished for this kind of in-betweenness. And I would suggest that it's because he's very clever at walking that line. He never goes so far as to trigger a real backlash. He's been a thorn in the side of his Western colleagues for years, but he's always kind of a nuisance, never really a threat, never really an existential threat. And so he knows exactly how far he can push his Western allies and when he needs to concede or climb down. But I think actually, the dynamics of how this works are actually quite different in NATO versus in the EU, but we can get into that later.
I actually, that's exactly where I was thinking we could go, Lawrence. How do we see this in practice? Maybe let's start with NATO. At a moment when NATO is sending in an unprecedented number of arms and other sources of support to the Ukrainian government, often through Poland, but sometimes through Hungary. How do we understand Hungary's role in that operation?
So I think that the relationship between Orban and NATO is interesting because Orban has never really used NATO as a boogeyman. He has never openly criticized NATO or questioned Hungary's NATO membership. And for the most part, he has also refrained from vetoing NATO initiatives or from creating real trouble within the organization. There are a few exceptions to this, but for the most part, he hasn't really been very active in trying to undermine NATO. And there might be different reasons for this. I think the first is that NATO is kind of an all or nothing deal. The main point of NATO is Article 5, right, which basically means that an attack on one NATO member is considered an attack on all, and therefore there's a huge benefit to Hungary for being under the United States' nuclear umbrella and being defended from any and all military encroachments by this alliance. But it's not like you can really get concessions from NATO that would be economic or political or diplomatic. NATO doesn't have that kind of power. It's not that kind of institution. So there's no real point in trying to finesse this in any way. And then the other reason is, within NATO, the most important state is the United States. And as we've seen over the past decade or so, a big chunk of the political elite in the United States, especially on one side of the political spectrum, actually looks to Orban as an inspiration or as a model to follow. And so there's also less of this ideological opposition, I think, between NATO and Hungary because of the big footprint that the United States has on NATO.
So is that an issue though now, Lawrence, with as you say, there having been a kind of at least a great deal of comfort between Orban and many of the people around Donald Trump, particularly Tucker Carlson, who in fact spent time with Orban and promoted him on his show. Is there now a tension that you have, in a sense, Donald Trump's nemesis, Joe Biden, as president and a sort of anti-Trump government in the United States? Has that changed the relationship between Hungary and NATO?
I think it has changed the U.S.-Hungarian relationship a little bit, but it's more that instead of a very frequent backslapping, right now there's basically just silence. It's not like Joe Biden has made it a priority to call out Viktor Orban for all of the steps that he's taking to build an illiberal state within Europe. There's been some quiet rebukes. Biden had this summit of democracies and Hungary wasn't invited and these kinds of things, but it hasn't really been vocal or really important. And at the same time, I think any foreign state to the United States who looks at the future of their state's relationship with the U.S. Probably has this thought that you never know who's going to be in power in 2 years, and the actual links between the conservative movement in the United States and Orban have only grown stronger since then. I mean, just this past week, the Conservative Political Action Conference, CPAC, organized its first meeting in Europe in Budapest with basically all of the Orban government taking center stage and being given this platform to talk about how they have built up their system. So I think these links are being forged and are stronger than ever. But of course, for that to really have an impact, of course, there would need to be another change in government in the United States. But I don't think that's out of the question.
That's extraordinary. I did not know that CPAC, which is one of the strongest, most influential conservative organizations, that they actually had just done an event in Budapest with Orban. I did not know that.
So this is actually very interesting. This made a lot of news in Hungary, and I have not seen any press about this in the United States. And I'm, me, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but the fact that nobody is talking about this, about the fact that an openly illiberal regime is basically hosting the biggest sort of conservative talk shop, right, and policy platform in the United States, it's quite extraordinary to me. And actually, some of the media that have been talking about this event have actually been talking about the fact that they are the only ones talking about it. So if you look at the English language press, it's almost there's just a few newspapers that are reporting on it, The Guardian being one of them. But it's really interesting to know that you who followed the region quite closely even didn't hear about this.
Right? No, that's extraordinary.
It's particularly interesting to me too because I think that we as Americans have this idea that what happens politically in other countries is really just ancillary to our own political disputes. But it seems like this is proving that it's almost fueling or at least justifying a lot of what's going on at home. But I think also there remains a broader question, which is why should Americans care about the regime in Hungary beyond simply the way it affects us? Because it seems like there have been a lot of violations, not just of democratic norms, but of human rights that are going on in Hungary that need to be addressed by our government, considering that there is such a close relationship between the two.
Yeah, I mean, the question of why the U.S. should care, I hate to be so flippant about it, but I'm not sure that the United States cares all that much. And I think that's one of the reasons why there hasn't been really much pushback from the Biden administration on all of these issues, is because they have more important things on their plate, right? I think the way in which it matters, right, is that right now Hungary is the main locus or agent of disunity within the European Union. And for the United States, I think, especially with this conflict that Russia, this war that Russia is waging in Ukraine, it's really important to have a united Europe that's hand in hand with the United States on sanctions policy, on arms exports, on supporting the Ukrainian regime. And up until now, actually, I've been very surprised at how seamlessly the United States and Europe have been cooperating on supporting the Ukrainian population. And that, I think, is the real risk to European unity on that is actually the Hungarian government.
So maybe we can talk about that a bit, Lawrence. You gave a very good description of Hungary's unique role with regard to NATO. The EU obviously cares about a lot of these issues, particularly the issues around human rights, issues around borders, and various other things. How has Hungary's relationship with the EU evolved the last year or two?
So I actually think that the change has not been terribly radical, in the sense that Orban's behavior in the EU has been relatively stable, in the sense that he has vetoed several important EU initiatives, whether it's on human rights in China or in the Middle East, or on migration policy, or on currently the one that he's sort of holding and lording over the European Union is he's threatening to veto the oil and gas embargo on Russia that the EU is hoping to pass next week at its next council meeting. So he has been doing this for years now. And again, I think the reason that he's gotten away with it in the EU is because he knows exactly how far he can push it. So if you think about it, Hungary has vetoed several sanctions packages against Russia, but in the end has always relented. It has actually been complying with the EU sanctions on Russia that have been in place ever since Russia took Crimea. So in a lot of ways, there's this chest beating. There's a lot of rhetoric from Orban that's very anti-EU, and at the same time, there's more actual policy in which very quietly he kind of climbs down when he realizes that he needs to. And so the reason for that, I think, is that Orban desperately needs EU funds to keep his regime in power, right? Because his power is ensured by the way that he can distribute via various means of corruption EU funds to his political cronies. And so the EU plays this dual role for him, where it provides this foil against which he rails all the time. His political message is usually that he's protecting the Hungarian population from an overreaching Brussels. But the EU also provides the funds that allow him to stay in power, right? So I think it's a much more complicated relationship. And he's been, I think, extremely adept at knowing exactly where that line is. Now, the question is, at a certain point, does he make a mistake and step over a line that's too important for the European Union, at which point this kind of falls apart? But for now, he's been very adept at managing this. And to be honest, the European Union has been also very weak at allowing this to happen and being content with these kind of last-minute capitulations.
But I wonder, Lawrence, have we reached a breaking point on the question of Russian energy, right? It does seem that there's a consensus in the EU to create not an immediate stoppage to Russian oil and gas coming into Europe. That's not feasible, but to put Europe on track to liberate itself from dependence on Russian oil and gas. And so far, it does appear Orban is opposed to that move by Europe, and he could, under EU rules, he can veto that, as you referred to. Would that be a breaking point if he sticks on that issue, or do you see him not sticking on that issue? Where do you see that going?
So I think we'll have a decent answer to that question next week when the European Council meets. And I see a couple of potential outcomes, right? So the first is that Orban is going to hold out until the very last minute so that he can get some sort of concessions from the EU, maybe a longer transition period or more EU funds to help offset the rising energy costs that such an embargo would come with, right? So basically, just hold out until he's bought off at the last minute. The other alternative I see is that Hungary will effectively block this move. What that would tell me is actually that Europe was less united on this than it may have seemed that from the outside, right? We know that the German government is not exactly raring to wean itself off of oil and gas coming from Russia. It's a really heavy lift for them. They're very dependent on Germany is very dependent on Russian oil, especially gas, and so it could actually be to Germany's benefit that Hungary makes it seem like they're the ones vetoing this, and quietly Germany is actually thankful for this. The third alternative, and this I think would be your question of if there's a rupture, there is talk now of a not quite EU embargo on Russia, which would basically mean that the 26 EU member states, without Hungary, would agree among themselves to an oil and gas embargo. And this has come up. Several people have suggested this. It's kind of in the conversation now. If we see that happening, that I think is a signal that the European Union is united and has decided that Hungary is an outcast, and they will basically just ignore them and go ahead with their Russia sanctions policy as they see fit, and kind of let Hungary sort of flap in the wind. And that I think would be a big marker of change, and I would expect then Orban to very quickly come back into the fold as soon as he can without losing face.
Can the EU do that, Lawrence?
So this is I always like this question because the answer is always no, but of course, right? So the EU cannot, in the sense that then it wouldn't be an EU embargo, because by definition, it's not the entire EU that's doing it. But you've seen these kinds of arrangements, right, where a lot of EU member states agree to do something, and it essentially, for all intents and purposes, looks like an EU mechanism, even though technically and legally it's not. You've seen this in the after the 2008 financial crisis, where they basically wanted to create a bailout fund. And they didn't want to call it a bailout fund, and the member states did not want to associate this with the European Union's institutions. So they basically created something that was parallel, but looked and talked and sounded exactly like an EU bailout fund. So that's basically a political decision. They can do it. Of course, it's a little bit more complicated because you need to figure out, how to keep Hungary from basically being a conduit for illegal Russian gas coming in. But right. those things are fixable problems.
Now, do you see within Hungary opinion on Orban, or at least opinion on Hungarian policy changing as a consequence of all these dynamics that we've just discussed?
So what I think is really interesting here, and to me was also surprising, is that the Russian war in Ukraine has actually increased Orban's popularity in Hungary. And you saw this in the elections that just happened. Orban won these elections with a very wide margin of support, and won it basically on a message that he is the one that should be trusted with Hungary's Russia-Ukraine policy. He basically argued that he's the one that can keep Hungarians out of this war, and the opposition are basically all warmongers who want to jump into this conflict. And it seemed like it was a winning message. So he actually has been strengthened, I think, by his by this kind of balancing in between. I think he's actually strengthened his hold on Hungarian institutions. Just yesterday or the day before, his government announced a new state of emergency, ostensibly due to the war in Ukraine. A previous state of emergency had been in place because of COVID, but that had kind of gone away. So he's popular at home. He's strong and well entrenched in power, and he's, I think, unlikely to go anywhere anytime soon.
Wow. And does the movement by Finland and Sweden to join NATO two countries that were formerly neutral. Does that change the dynamic within Hungary and for Orban, or is that more of the same?
I think that question of itself is not particularly salient in Hungary, either for Orban or for anybody else. Um, I have a tough time imagining that Orban would try to veto a Finnish or Swedish accession to NATO. I think he also knows that he can hide behind Ankara and President Erdogan's statement that he's the Turkish government is trying to get some concessions before
Sure.
Saying yes to that. So Orban nor his government had said anything on this that makes it seem like they would be ready to veto this. They've been kind of straddling the fence on this in general, but I don't think that that's going to make much of a difference. Again, NATO is not a very important talking point or organization against which Orban can set himself up as the protector of the Hungarian nation. So it's just not really very much in the conversation in Hungary.
So what you seem to describe then is sort of a leader who is has almost complete control at home, but in some ways little leverage abroad, at least within NATO. But why do you think that of his sort of rise, at least in terms of prominence in the American right? Because I think, at least to me, it's very interesting that the hero of the American right nowadays seems to be more Viktor Orban than Donald Trump sometimes. Do you think that is sort of significant of a broader international profile that he's trying to build as a sort of leader of the right around the world?
So, first of all, yes, I think he does have ambitions to become a global figure of this, I think what he calls sort of illiberal democracy, right? I think it's more on the European stage that he's trying to do this. He has, for the longest time, tried to become the leader of nationalist populist movements in Europe, trying to rally, France's Front National and a bunch of different far right or at least populist parties across Europe, with not too much success, to be honest. But I think that to your first question of why he's so popular, I think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, he has some of these characteristics of Trump, but he's just much smarter. And he actually knows how to pull the levers of power. So I think for American sort of conservatives who believe in this kind of worldview of a more nationalist, illiberal worldview, he has shown exactly how you use legal means, right, to change constitutions, to change laws, to appoint people to certain key positions, right, where nobody can accuse Viktor Orban of launching a coup or taking power violently, right? The genius of what he has done is that he has actually just used democratic means to hollow out a lot of those institutions that guarantee democracy and liberal rights, and that I think is very attractive to this brand of conservatism everywhere. Is that tactic, right? And so for that reason, I think he's been quite popular. And then to your last question, which is about how Viktor Orban is very popular at home, but at the same time not very influential internationally, I would just add a caveat to that. I don't think he's very influential within NATO, but I do think he's influential in the EU. He's been able to get a lot of concessions from the European Union, get a lot of sweetheart deals, get a lot of funding from the EU, and he, a lot of these. If you look at the press on the EU today, the main things that you see in terms of EU news right now are all about him. Everybody's trying to figure out what to do about his veto. So he actually can set the agenda in the European Union in a way that I think is quite extraordinary.
So I guess the big historical question I have, and it comes to a set of themes we explore every week on the podcast, trying to understand how much of the past we see in the present and what's new today. That's really not a repeat of the past. I struggle with that in trying to think about the geopolitics of Europe then today. Is Orban a sign of a Europe that's going back to two camps, back to an East versus West? Or is it more a return of what Milan Kundera and others called a unique Central European identity that has a curious view of liberalism, a different perspective on democracy, and stands between the two big East and West powers? How do you see this in that historical framework, Lawrence?
So I actually think that this is the wrong way to look at it. When I look at this, I don't see two camps. What I see is actually, especially on Russia's invasion of Ukraine, what I see is a Western camp and a lonely dude in a little tent in the forest to the side, right? And that's what. Right? That's not a camp, right? That's just a
it's a tent, as you said.
It's just a tent, right? And so what I think is actually quite interesting here is precisely the fact that this has not led to a rift between the East and West. What it has led to is a rift within Eastern Europe. If you just looked at the state of the European Union 2 years ago, right? There was kind of an emerging split between East and West on a lot of different issues, right? You had Poland and Hungary and Slovenia with their leaders all, following the same kind of illiberal path. You seem to have this kind of, two camps as you talked about. But that has actually disappeared. What I think you've seen in the past couple of months is really the disintegration of this Eastern European bloc. There used to be this thing called the Visegrad Group, which was, Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, and Slovakia, who coordinated a lot on all sorts of EU issues to try to make sure that Eastern Europe was well represented. They haven't met since the Ukraine conflict because the Poles and the Slovaks have said that they're so disgusted by Viktor Orban's sort of fence straddling on this issue that they don't want to meet. And so you've actually seen a wedge being driven not between East and West, I think, but between Eastern Europe and Hungary itself. And so this is more a question, I think, of Hungary becoming more isolated within Europe and even within Eastern Europe because of Russia. And the other thing in terms of your question about the historical perspective, right? I mean, thinking back to Hungarian history, right? I mean, Hungary has never been on the right side of a war, at least not in the past 150 years, right? And so, in a way, this is par for the course, unfortunately, right? So, if you're looking for historical analogies, right, Hungary has never really chosen the right side, and Hungary has never been able to avoid a war that has raged on its borders, right? Hungary is a landlocked country that has sort of seen every single, army traipse through its territory, whether it was the Turks, whether it was the Austrians, whether it was the Germans, whether it was the Russians, right? And so this idea that somehow Hungary can keep out of a war that's a European war is just, to anybody who's studied history, I think this is nonsensical. But that, I think, is, to a certain extent, the historical analogy here. But the question of whether history will repeat itself in that way, of course, is a more difficult one.
Well, and I guess one area for hope then is that so far Hungary has at least cooperated with most of its Western allies in trying to at least help the Ukrainians. So maybe they're on the right side this time, if that's the right side. And I guess the closing question we have for you, Lawrence, as you know, we always like to close on an optimistic note, well-informed, not naive, but still optimistic note. If you were sitting in Washington right now and advising whoever it is in the State Department and elsewhere who's concerned about Hungary or has the Hungarian portfolio, what advice would you give them for nurturing a better relationship with Orban for the purposes of strengthening NATO and the EU. Not pretending that Orban is ever going to accept all the positions the United States and Western Europe offer, but what kind of relationship do you see as a possibility that could be useful for both sides of that relationship?
That's a tough one. I think there's the traditional ideas of how to pressure Orban into being, more friendly towards liberal norms and democracy and human rights, I think are all going to backfire because it adds fuel to the fire that these Western countries are trying to influence the Hungarian political system, and Orban is the only one that can protect the nation from that kind of interference. I think what I would say is to be very, very blunt with the European Union, that the United States supports the EU taking a much harder line on Hungary. And this is where I think there might be a sea change coming, because the European Union has been very, very slow to respond to corruption and to the erosion of rule of law and democratic values in Hungary. But I think that tide is turning. And I don't actually think it has very much to do with Russia, actually. I think it's been a long time coming. And I would expect that EU funds are going to dry up relatively soon. And there's going to be many, many EU conditions on the rule of law that are going to come into force in the next couple of years. And I think having the US be very supportive of that, encouraging that, trying to hurry that along would probably be my best bet. I think other than that, I'm actually not very sure that there's much that the United States government can do to shift the political calculus of Orban. Because all the things that would be real threats or I think are unreasonable. The United States is not going to threaten to withdraw Article 5 protections from Hungary at this moment. So I think that would just be that's not within the realm of the possible. So I think right now it's just trying to support the EU cracking down a lot more on this kind of rule of law backsliding.
Gotcha. It's a very good point you raised, though. In a certain way, the United States is more dependent on Orban, and he has more leverage now because we don't want him getting in the way of aid shipments and other efforts to help the Ukrainians, which he could get in the way of if he wanted to be more obstructionist. And as you pointed out, he has not been actually that obstructionist. So, in a sense, he has more leverage now than ever.
I think that's true. And the usual things in terms of how one takes the long game approach, right? Supporting independent journalism and investigative journalism in Hungary, these kinds of things, right? Those at the end of the day are going to, once there is enough political opposition to Orban, those are going to come very much in handy. But those aren't going to fix the problem sort of in the next year or two. Those are long-term investments in kind of democracy and liberalism abroad. You've studied the Cold War, right? It took decades and decades of that to bear fruit. But when it did, it guaranteed 20 years of absolutely American-friendly allies in Eastern Europe. So I think it was worth the investment. Absolutely.
Well said, Lawrence. Zachary, your poem In Between, it seems to me, captures some of the themes that Lawrence has articulated so well, and themes we come back to week after week, that in some ways the future of democracy is defined less in the center and obvious places of power, but often in the in-between spaces. That's true within societies. That's true between societies. Does this discussion of Hungary, does it resonate with the concerns that you think other young people have about foreign policy and democracy and future of Europe and European security?
Yes, I think it does. I think we as Americans have a very hypocritical view of the European Union as a dysfunctional institution. And I think that hopefully this crisis will sort of shore up the institutions of the European Union, at least from a symbolic perspective. And I think that the European response to Hungary's nascent authoritarianism and and sort of anti-Western response to the war in Ukraine is definitely going to be at the center of that European response. So I do think that it will inspire at least greater confidence in the European Union if it goes well. But if it goes badly, I think there is a real possibility that the European Union will lose credibility in the eyes of the world if it does not manage to respond to this crisis in Ukraine, or continue to respond to this crisis in Ukraine with a united front.
Interesting. So in a way, the stakes are higher than
I think
they've been
so.
Before.
At least from a public relations perspective.
Right. But it does remind people why it matters.
Exactly.
Which is an opportunity. Lawrence, thank you for joining us today. You've elucidated, as only you can, the complex interconnections between this tent we might call Orban on the side of the mountain and all the other powerful actors and camps around him. I love that metaphor, Lawrence. Thank you for sharing your insights with us today.
Well, happy to be here.
And Zachary, thank you for your poem. And thank you most of all to our loyal listeners for joining us for this episode of This Is Democracy.
This podcast is produced by the Liberal Arts ITS Development Studio
and the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Texas at Austin.
The music in this episode was written and recorded by Harris Codini. Stay tuned for a new episode every week. You can find This Is Democracy on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Stitcher.
See you next time.